Hi guys, so we are continuing in our Bible study today, looking at kind of examples of what it means to love our neighbors and to love neighbors well. And today we're going to be looking at Luke chapter 8 verses 40 through 56. You'll see in this text that at no point does the word neighbor come up, and yet I think it's very much an example of Jesus neighboring, and that there's some great things that we can pull from it. So I'm going to read it through once, and then we will kind of tiptoe our way through it together. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him, for they were all waiting for him. Just then there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. He fell at Jesus' feet, began pleading with him to come to his house, for he had an only daughter, about 12 years old, and she was dying. As Jesus went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. And though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. She came up behind Jesus and touched the fringe of his cloak. And immediately her flow of blood stopped. Then Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are hemming you in and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed that power had gone out from me." When the woman realized that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared in the presence of all the people while she had touched him, and how she had been immediately healed. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." While he was still speaking, someone came up from the synagogue leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer." When Jesus heard this, he replied, "Do not be afraid. Only believe. She will be saved." When he came to the house, he did not allow anyone to enter with him, except Peter, John, and James, the child's father and the child's mother. Everyone was weeping and grieving for her. But he said, "Do not cry, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned, and she stood up at once, and he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astounded, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened. Okay, so we are going back to the beginning in verse 1 of chapter 40. Of verse 40 of chapter 8. Now when Jesus returned, the crowd welcomed him. So he had been on the western side of the Sea of Galilee and had been doing healing. So what's before this? We had the calming of the storm when he had traveled to that side of the sea. And then the story of the man healing, or of Jesus encountering a man possessed by demons, and Jesus having those demons go into a herd of pigs. That all just happened before. So he's been healing and doing kind of really miraculous things. He travels back to the other side, the side closer to Jerusalem, with a higher population of Jewish people. And when he gets off the boat there, he's greeted by this crowd. It doesn't tell us where he was planning on going. We don't know if they were going to rest, if they were headed to worship, if he was going someplace to teach. But we know is that as soon as he got off the boat, crowds welcomed him. And it says they had been waiting for him. And just then there came a man named Jairus, a leader of the synagogue. So whatever he was doing in the midst of that, Jairus shows up, and it says he is a leader of the synagogue. What that means in that cultural context is, let me zoom in on my notes. He would have been responsible for the worship that took place in the local synagogue. And so that he organized it. He was kind of like the president or the administrator in that. He would have had like high public stature and relatively wealthy. And so he was in good standing and respected. So he fell at Jesus's feet and began pleading with him to come to his house. This is for sure a sign of humility. The fact that he humbles himself and that isn't stoic, isn't like overly in control of his emotions, and that he pleads with Jesus and humbling himself before a different religious leader. It is showing, the level of love that he has for his daughter and his willingness to be humble in the face of, tragedy. For he had an only daughter about 12 years old, and she was dying. 12 years is symbolic within the Jewish customs at the time of that's when she would be like entering into womanhood or adulthood. It was the same for boys too. Like 12 was the mark of going from a child to an adult. And even more so, there like adolescence, there wasn't the span of adolescence like we have now. In teenage years is when they would be betrothed, married, and begin having children. So, she's entering that phase of like preparing for that. Okay, so we have the scene. What's the scene? Jesus has just gotten off a boat. In the midst of that, a man approaches him and asks him to come and save his daughter. Okay, so not where he was planning on going, but it says the next words are, as he went. So Jesus stops what he's doing, obviously, to go help a man whose daughter is about to die. As he went, the crowds pressed in on him. Now, there was a woman who was suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years, and though she had spent all she had on physicians, no one could cure her. So now we have a totally different people, right? Like, he's talking to Jairus, knowing that he's going to help save the daughter, and we're introduced to this new figure, a woman who had menstrual flow for 12 years. That would have made her unclean within the Jewish customs at the time. She would have not been able to participate in religious rituals. She would have been seen as kind of cursed or not good enough from her peers and her family, probably ostracized. And you can tell, it says that she invested a lot of her time and her energy into trying to be healed. So she was likely of wealthy stature.
Mommy?
I am doing a Bible study video right now. Like, I'm recording it as we speak. It's interesting because this one's on interruptions. Love you. Okay. Let's see. She had invested a lot of money in it, which means she probably came from a wealthy family and had tried to find healing, which, I have all kinds of medical stuff, and I'm sure you guys have had all kinds of medical stuff. It's really frustrating when there's no solution, and there's 12 years of no solution, and no one could cure her. So this wasn't just she wasn't feeling well. This sickness resulted, or whatever's going on with her hormonally or whatever, is keeping her from full life. It's keeping her from being able to be a part of the community. It's keeping her from being able to be like married and have children and all of the things. She would have been outside of the fold. And it says she came up behind Jesus. So there's this giant crowd who's pushing on him like he's a rock star coming through town. And she's a part of that crowd. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his cloak. On the robes that they would wear at the time, there would be tassels, and that's what this is talking about, that she would have reached out and touched one of the tassels on his robe. And then it says, and immediately her flow of blood stopped. Right? It wasn't nothing, like all she had to do was touch the tassel. She didn't even touch his skin. He hasn't said anything to her at this point. All she had to do was touch the tassel, and she was healed. Jesus asked, "Who touched me?" When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the crowds are hemming in and pressing against you." Man, there are so many people who are touching you. Like, what do you mean, who touched you? But Jesus said, "Someone touched me, for I noticed the power had gone from me." So he's talking specifically about this intentional touch that resulted in power going from him. I don't think we often reflect on the idea that what Jesus did actually took energy from him, that there was an personal investment or a personal loss that accompanied it. But we get a taste of that here. He knows something happened because he can feel it. When the woman realized that she could not remain hidden, she came trembling and falling down before him. She declared in the presence of all the people why she had touched him and how she had been immediately healed. So you have this woman who has been ostracized, who has been outside of the community, who took a chance on showing up in the crowd and touching Jesus because she had hope, right? And now she is being put in the spotlight again. You can tell she's terrified, like what's going to happen? Like did I do something wrong? Are people going to judge me for it? What's going to happen? She has that same humility that we see from Jairus earlier, as far as falling down at his feet and overflowing with her emotions. Jesus said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." So he paused and he said some words to her, "Daughter." Now, we hear in other places, we've talked about how Jesus refers to people that he has met as women sometimes, and that's not really as kind of offensive as it sounds to us, that was a little bit of a term of endearment for the time. Daughter is even more so. She had been cut off from all of her connection. She had been like entirely disconnected, right? And he is referring to her with this intimate connection. We are family. We are tied by blood. We are, like that's a beautiful term of endearment. Your faith has made you well. He is lifting her up. He, in the midst of all of these people who have come because Jesus is this amazing man of faith, he has lifted her up to say she is an example of what we are trying to aim for. Your faith has made you well, right? And again, just this, like, you have agency, you have power, you made a choice, you made this thing happen. This is you and, Jesus working together. But again, for a person who had been totally cut off, who has not had any personal agency, who has not been able to achieve or live into her dreams, like he's saying, like, you've done something beautiful. Go in peace. So it's not just walk away quietly. It's this, you are whole now. You are complete now. Embrace that, embody it. Like, this is the beginning of the next chapter, and fully live into that. What's cool is that there are historians 300 years later than this. So, or roughly 300 years later, so that talk about this woman and say that she went back to her hometown and erected a statue. Like, because she was wealthy, she hired somebody to create a statue that commemorates this moment. And they reference it within like the history of not just Jewish faith, but of just the time and the region of it. Like, it was that significant. And because of that, because she was so moved by it, because her life really did take next chapter, it was a widely known story within the early church. Okay, so that's the end of this little like piece. We have Jesus stopping, right? He's on his way to see Jairus' daughter to help, and he pauses to see her. He could have just continued, even after she touched him, he could have continued to walk on, because the healing didn't need him to stop. It already happened. He could have felt the power, and he could have, trudged on, and she still would have been healed. But he paused because what he also needed was not just to heal her physicalness. He needed to heal her emotional, mental, relationshipness. He needed to say the things to her. He needed to call her daughter. He needed to acknowledge her faith. He needed to tell her that she is whole. Those things all needed to happen in relationship to this physical healing. And they were significant. And so Jesus took the interruption, paused, and handled it. So now we segue back. While he was still speaking, someone from the synagogue leader's house came to say, "Your daughter is dead. Do not trouble the teacher any longer. You took too long. It's not, there's no way to save her anymore. Stop wasting Jesus's time." And when Jesus heard this, he replied, talking to the Father, he says, "Do not be afraid, only believe, and she will be saved." And so again, he's offering that peace, that wholeness, that completeness. Like, you are in the company of, you've done the right thing. You've come and you've gotten me. Continue to maintain that faith, just as the woman had faith. Your daughter is going to be okay. When they came to the house, He did not allow anyone to enter with him, except Peter, John, and James, and the child's father and mother. Everyone was weeping and grieving for her, and he said, "Do not cry, for she is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him, knowing that she was dead. But taking her by the hand, he called her out, "Child, get up." Her spirit returned, and she stood up at once, and he directed them to give her something to eat. Her parents were astonished, but ordered them to tell no one what had happened. And so we have this moment, right? Like Jesus paused on the journey here. The girl had died. We don't know if he hadn't paused, if he would have gotten there in time. But everybody feels that there is no hope for her. And that's got to be devastating. The only child, she's 12 years old. The mother and father are here. Peter, James, and John come along, and they enter. And is she actually sleeping and people didn't recognize that she was sleeping? Like, apparently there is historical record of people being buried alive because it was important to get the body cared for once somebody passed, to care for their body and get them entombed as quickly as possible. And sometimes that meant that they misjudged the finality. So maybe she was just really, really sick and Jesus heals her. Maybe there's also lots of people who suggest that she was fully dead and this is a resurrection story, that Jesus brings her back from the dead. And so regardless, what we have is Jesus stepping in and doing something significant and meaningful and miraculous. And I love in it that, again, he calls her child, like, get up. So she stood up at once. We're not just talking like she opened her eyes or moved a finger. Like, she got up. Her parents were astounded, but he ordered them to tell no one what had happened. And he directs them to get her something to eat. Like, this is just happening, but he's worried about her being famished. Like, go get her some food now. I think that's all awesome. As we look at this from the context of our conversations about neighboring, as Graham came in, I kind of alluded to that. But what I'm looking at here, what I'm moved by in this, is how all of this happened due to an interruption and Jesus responding to that interruption. There are so many times we are kind of beelining our way for something and something pops up, a person, a situation, a need. And we have a choice whether to continue on the path that we were on or to pause and be a part of this new experience. And in this story, Jesus does it twice. He goes to follow Jairus, and he interacts with the woman. And in both of the cases, that pause, that interruption led to restoration and like somebody's life being changed by it. I think that that's true in big and small ways, that the interruptions that we encounter on a day-to-day basis have a possibility of leading to fuller life if we follow that tangent or that interruption. So yeah, it's just something to think about, how quickly we shut down interruptions, and then what are the potential blessings and gifts that come on the other side of them if we fully show up in those moments. So I hope it just gives you something to think about as you interact in your world this week and in the neighborhoods and with the people that God puts in your path. I hope that you feel blessed by it. Bye, friends.